You don't think I should bring them up
You
again
can
just to
if you
remind
want. You
myself?
can if you want. Look, it's shooting it raw. It's basically, it's a bit,
Okay, don't be too raw. Okay, it's not recording yet, is it?
of course.
Oh no, Ran, please don't record yet. Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw.
Let's
The,
move.
the next photograph I have is okay. Let me describe it. Okay,
Yes.
so it's it's titled Sustainable Seafood Symposium, and it's a photograph of a room that can hold probably about 100 people or so, and there's maybe about 75 to 100 people sitting in chairs. It's a symposium, so there seems to be I guess a panel of about two, four, six people speaking off on the left hand side. And there's some bunch of people just sitting at their writing notes, listening, paying attention. It seems to be a crowd in Hong Kong. Somebody hidden at the back is holding a microphone and asking a question, it looks like. And what it's a sustainable seafood symposium. So why is this a keystone or a key image in your life?
In my life right now. I think because it's so current. You did ask for current photos, and it's also such an important part of my work at this present moment in my life. So the Sustainable Seafood Symposium, which is the picture captured there, we basically ran that in 2017. So I'd already moved back to Cape Town by then. After having lived in Hong Kong for 10 years and having moved from CSR Asia, I went into work in the fishing industry at Pacific Andes. And then towards my fifth year at Pacific Andes, had a bit of a life change moment where my stepfather had a stroke. And I think it was a kind of a pinnacle point where I had some questions about where I should be in the world, and going home seemed to make the most sense. And it was a strong message basically saying time is short. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's how I transitioned back to Cape Town. But the company was really kind. They, because it was for family reasons and the Ung family, very family oriented, they said, carry on working for us, but from Cape Town. So that's how I transitioned back here.
Oh wow.
And then, but after having been home after a year or so, I slowly started moving more into projects here locally, and also working as a freelance consultant, having left Pacific Andes by then. And at that point, I got a phone call from George Woodman, who is from the Teng Hoi Conservation Organization, Teng Hoi, and he had participated in a symposium I had helped arrange back in 2015 in Hong Kong, when I was working in the industry. And we brought together a panel of experts to talk about illegal fishing, about sustainable seafood sourcing, and to try and educate the local Hong Kong buying community. So we're talking about corporate buying, company corporate buying, like retailers, hotels, seafood distributors, etc., about what sustainable seafood is all about, including a seafood tasting so that people could literally taste the difference, or you can't really taste the difference between a certified product and a non-certified product. So it was basically an educational symposium. And George called me up when I was in Cape Town saying, how about coming back to Hong Kong and organizing another one? And so that's how I landed up, as you do, that's how I landed up organizing a second seafood, which we say is industry-led, because it was very much industry-led. It wasn't organized by an NGO originally at all. It was more the industry taking it upon themselves to educate the industry. So a big, large fishing company trying to educate other buyers and sellers of seafood on what is sustainable seafood. And so the second symposium was actually independent completely. It was funded by ADM Capital Foundation, and it was supported by Teng Hoi. And we basically pulled together the audience of about 100 or so people and managed to get experts from across the world to come and speak, again, on topics of illegal fishing. This time we brought in human rights, labor standards as well, because modern slavery is a big concern in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue of live reef fish trade, which is prevalent in Hong Kong. So we had Yvonne Sadovi speaking. And after, a few hours of this, the audience turned around in the afternoon and said, well, we know this is a huge concern. As buyers of seafood and as sellers of seafood, we know this is an issue, but we don't want to tackle this alone. I mean, it's an impossible issue to tackle this alone. The challenge is so enormous. So that's where Hugh Thomas from the UK, he was there speaking as an expert working at Pew Charitable Trust at the time on IUU, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And he whispered in our ears, into George and my ears, saying how you might want to consider for Hong Kong a model that has worked very well in the UK called the Sustainable Seafood Coalition, SSC. And at that point, George and I looked at each other and said, okay, let's go ahead. Let's suggest this. And to the audience, we might want to consider pulling together a coalition of sorts of the private sector to tackle these issues together. And that's exactly what we did. And there was interest. And we took that back and pulled together a symposium report and finally pitched the fact that, a sustainable seafood coalition in Hong Kong could potentially do very well. And that's how we landed up launching the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition. So that symposium, that photo you're seeing, is actually a really important point in which the direction to move towards this private sector coalition was established.
Okay. Wow.
So it was a very important symposium, let's put it that way.
So in terms of the impact of that symposium and I know the past year or 2 years has been completely topsy-turvy, but looking at it now and looking backward, what is the real lasting effect? What can you say, what outcome would you be proud of that you would say, this is something I'm very happy about that has lasted?
I think having 15 companies join us in the last 2 years and really showing commitment to a sourcing code of practice, we call it. We've got these, this code of practice, code of conduct, voluntary codes of conduct on seafood sourcing and seafood labeling. The fact that these 15 companies have stepped up and, despite the challenges in gaining access to information down your supply chain, the traceability challenges, the challenges of identifying vessels of where the fish is coming from, etc. Despite this, they've put their names forward to say we're committed to this, and we know it's going to take a lot of time, but over time we want to move towards more transparent seafood supply chains. And I think that in itself is a success point, the fact that we've got these 15 companies that are committed. And we want to grow. We really, really want to double the numbers, say, in the next year or two, and to have a force for good, I suppose, or a theory of change of which you can show the government in Hong Kong that if the private sector are willing to move on this, then let's make this a requirement for all.
Okay.
And this is a small cohort of private sector buyers and sellers of seafood, and some of them might not even be the largest in Hong Kong, right?
Sure.
We're talking about, medium-sized seafood distributors. But the fact is that they're willing to capture this information down their seafood supply chains and make sourcing decisions based on this. That is a sign, I think, for government policymakers to listen to and say, okay, well, if you guys are willing to do this, then let's make this a requirement more broadly. So I think that I suppose it's a hope factor. It's a hope that this can influence things going forward.
To give some people maybe some perspective, has it happened that you go to the supermarket in Capetown and you see something that is somehow oddly enough linked back to Hong Kong, or does the supply chain not actually reach you?
No, if anything, it will be the other way around.
Okay.
So Hong Kong will be picking up products that are originated in South Africa.
Okay.
I mean, Hong Kong imports, I think numbers are so high. I mean, customs data shows the number of countries that Hong Kong's importing from, over 170 countries.
Oh, wow. So
you can 170 countries, and could be more, slightly more than that. basically, there's research we want to do at the HKSSC, which we haven't managed to find funding for yet, but we want to map out the seafood trade flows in Hong Kong. So exactly where it's coming from, where it lands up, which warehouses it goes, it stops through to land up before it goes to a restaurant or retail shop or whatever it might be. Sometimes it goes direct from the airports, maybe perhaps to the restaurants. We don't know which wet markets it goes via. We want to map the whole thing out to make it easier for our members to be able to map their own supply chain. And that's the first point. And the second point is also then to have some recommendations for policy change. And so having initially looked into this, writing this proposal for the research and working with people like Yvonne Sadovi, it's been so helpful to find out customs data is showing that Hong Kong imports from over 170 countries, and South Africa being one of them. Now, in terms of the South Africa-Hong Kong link, there's multiple species that Hong Kong would be importing from South Africa. Could be rock lobster. They like their live lobster in Hong Kong. But one very problematic species is abalone, and I suppose in a way that's why I feel so passionate about trying to make sure that this Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition is a success. And my direct interest, being based here in Cape Town, is to hear and to see how much abalone lands up in Hong Kong. So 90% of the abalone that is harvested here lands up in the east in Hong Kong, which then gets re-exported elsewhere. And 60% of that is regarded to be illegal.
Oh,
so that's it's been poached. And this is coming from research done by Traffic and other NGOs, which have written excellent reports on this. So the status of abalone we know is very, very bad in South Africa, and yet it continues to get poached. And it's such a complicated beast to even try and tackle. And they've been trying to do it for many, many years, the NGO community with the government. But it's so caught up in networks and even the drug trafficking trade, and it's so complicated. And you kind of think, well, what role can the private sector play in terms of the purchasing side? And one thing that if the Hong Kong buyers of seafood could help implement, just asking for health certificates, number one. Where is that seafood coming from, and has it been through a processing facility? Because if it's been through a factory or processing facility which has got a legal health certificate attached to it, then you can pretty much know, okay, that comes from a legal source.
Yeah, it's traceable.
It's traceable to a legal source. Whereas if it doesn't have a health certificate, it's pretty much illegal. It's been poached and dried through some informal facility.
Right.
So
I find it really funny.
Sorry, one thing, Rand, just to point out, currently health certificates are not mandated in Hong Kong. It's voluntary for the seafood trade. So that's it's a low-hanging fruit. If we can just make this mandatory across, let's just have this documentation trail across the seafood space, it would start making things a lot easier to secure sources from more legal sources.
Right. I always find it interesting to talk to people who are optimists. I'm an optimist, and yet, it's for the people who aren't optimists out there. I often find that people who do work like people like you, where the work is actually brutal and it's very upsetting if you sit and think about it, and yet somehow you're able to tease out this like path or tunnel or something of optimism that, there's light at the end of this really grim tunnel. Because look, I look at you. You're smiling. You're bright, and you're talking about this stuff that is making me basically cry inside, and yet it's amazing. It's amazing.
Well, I also, because I'm working in the industry space, I also get to hear some really good stories happening. The positives, the fisheries improvement projects happening on the ground, and what's being mobilized from the private sector world. And there's a lot of energy around this. I mean, the writing is on the wall. Buyers of seafood going forward are going to be asking more and more questions down their supply chain. So it makes kind of sense why those 15 companies have joined the Hong Kong Sustainable
Sure.
Seafood Coalition, because they see this as the future.
Right.
So they're just being a bit forward thinking. And I really believe that this is the direction we're all going to go in. Policies are going to start shifting and changing, maybe a bit slow in some countries and others, but we're all going to eventually move in that direction. And thank goodness for the activists on the ground. You know, they bring the core issues to the fore, and even though sometimes it can be a pain in the ass for a company because, you know, it causes them so much headache, but essentially it brings out movement in the right direction.
Sure.
And I'm a big fan of transparency in that, you know, even big fishing companies, you know, great tool for fishing companies now, just like any company working in any sector, is a sustainability report, for example. So, you know, if all companies are producing sustainability reports and they're doing it well, then any stakeholder should be able to read, what is that company culture like? What is the governance system like? What are the decision-making powers? Who's given decision-making powers, etc.? What committees exist at the board level to oversee environmental, social, governance issues? You know, what's happening throughout the departments? Are the departments talking to each other? Are they operating in silos? What are the policies on environmental, social, human issues? I think going forward, having transparency like that is really important, because then stakeholders can ask questions and they can point out flaws. And together, everyone moves in a forward direction.
Sure.
If you've got no basis on which to have a conversation, because if no one's being transparent, stakeholders can't even ask questions.
Sure.
They don't even know, what are you doing right, what are you doing wrong? But the more transparency there is out there, even with the criticism, it comes with that change and movement in the right direction.
Sure.
And I wish they would mandate that. I wish every country would mandate companies, listed companies and non-listed companies, to produce sustainability reports, because then you wouldn't have the problems that we see in South Korea with Ian Obina wrote that beautiful book, The Outlaw Ocean, which talks about the huge problems happening, you know, human rights issues happening on vessels in certain fleets, certain countries.
Yeah.
And if there was more transparency amongst that company in particular, if they had to produce a sustainability report, for example, one could then start drilling a lot deeper.
Sure.
And say, well, what is this, a governance issue? Is it a culture issue? You know, where do we need to start putting change into the mindsets of certain executives, for example? And so I feel that there's a lot of potential to be had in more transparency.
Sure.
And I see this all the time. So that's probably why I'm an optimist, because I do see positive things happening.
So is life really a gift? Really? Can you make every second count? That's the whole point of the podcast. So if you like what you've seen and you're inspired, because that really is my mission, then please give it a like, subscribe, and share.
Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw.